Cody Dickerson. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be speaking with you. So you are the author of The Language of the Corpse, which is being released by Three Hands Press, and it's looking at essentially death in Indo-European, but especially European tradition and mythology, and including Icelandic as well. So perhaps before we get into that, you could just give us a little bit about your background.
Well, I've been a student of, I guess you could say, religion and the occult for about 20 years now, and it's developed slowly, and it's on, in its own trajectory over the years.
Yeah,
I think, my early introductions to more of a pagan approach, I think, to life and especially wild places. I
yeah,
really owe a debt to my family in that regard. And so, as time went on, I was introduced to initially to the runic tradition, and everything kind of spread out from that point. In my early 20s,
yeah.
getting into ancient Germanic religion, and then from there into Indo-European religion, and particularly sorcery, really took a huge interest in that. And so I've been working in, I guess you could say, maybe more of a hands-on fashion for about 15 years,
Okay.
and that's taken all manners of manifestation, I guess.
Yeah.
Early on runic work for sure.
Well, so perhaps you could just talk about you mentioned that your family was responsible in part for getting you interested in this, if I understand you correctly, or
Um, yeah, I mean, initially, in some ways, my mother's side of the family were German immigrants,
okay,
and so they were active, active, and then some not so active Methodists. But
okay.
we spent a lot of time in nature, growing up out here in the West in North America. A lot of wild places and a lot of roadless wilderness, I guess. And
Mm,
so, spending that time there, and really kind of cultivating a relationship with those places, really,
yeah.
I think, really affected my worldview in a really positive way. And
Mm,
my first, um, I guess you could maybe consider the magical transmissions came, from my maternal line on my mom's side and from my grandfather. Just simple folk magic charms that were shockingly effective. And
oh, really?
yeah, definitely. The
Mm.
first one would have been wart removal with the
Oh,
potato
okay.
on
Oh,
the full
really?
moon.
Yeah.
But it
Uh-huh.
was I was probably 10 years old, and that was really pretty remarkable how effective that was, and that I think impacted my view on the world in a lot of different ways. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
I'd been open to those ideas and concepts from a really young age, and it
yeah.
just kind of developed over time.
Yeah, well, you said a couple of things which actually I just wanted to comment on, and you mentioned the wilderness in America, and also the charms that came from your family, from I guess from Germany originally, and I think Americans don't quite appreciate just how even sort of 30 or 40 years ago. Most European countries was still sort of steeped in at least the remnants of and superstitions that probably had pretty ancient roots, and it was still really quite visible at that time. Even when I was growing up, there was still people would hang a horseshoe above a door and this sort of thing,
Oh, sure, yeah.
and loads of other things, and even the Tower of London. There's a whole superstition around that, and they have to have at least two ravens there all the time, because if they fly away, then England's going to collapse. And if you look at
Hmm,
the names of the ravens, they're all names like Odin and Thor and this kind of thing.
sure,
Yeah, but
yeah.
and I think but Europeans don't actually quite appreciate that America has this sort of vast wilderness as well, probably much more than Europe does, I would think, at this point.
Yeah,
And you can really sort of get lost, and people sometimes in America do get lost and do end up dying in the
yeah,
wilderness,
absolutely.
which would be pretty hard in Britain, and probably most European countries. It has to be said. Maybe not
Yeah,
Germany, but
it's pretty open out here, and I think a lot of people really savor, our position on the food chain, but out here that's definitely not the case either.
right, right.
large cats, wolves, grizzly
Right,
bears,
right.
things
Yeah,
like that. So it
yeah,
really right sizes you, spending time out here, and you have to be very aware, when you're
yeah,
in those places of what's going on. So it really kind of dials you back into being in touch with the natural world, and I think that really, at least for myself, and I know other folks as well, it really helps to kind of brings a lot of the folklore um, into focus in a way that you can understand it. You can understand on a more personal level, and really,
yeah.
makes a lot of that applicable, in your daily life if you're interacting with the land and things like that. So yeah, they're not. It's not always just about cute superstitions and curiosities
Yeah.
as much as it tends to be with in other places that maybe aren't so wild.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've been pretty much in New York City for a long time, but recently I've been a little bit more out in the country, and the tiniest bit. But even then, I've seen like a flock of wild geese or rabbit just walking around and stuff like this, and
Sure.
it's sort of immediately obvious that nature, in a way, is a kind of consciousness, right? And it makes so much more sense of even things like superstitions of like seeing a bird or something fly away. I mean, if you really were immersed in nature, which obviously everyone was at one point, you could obviously read things a lot more easily than we can and dismiss today.
Absolutely. Even, as you mentioned, just short periods of time spent there, in wild places is really, I think, really beneficial, particularly to people that are, I mean, just in general, as far as really, having a very soothing effect. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
you know,
definitely. Yeah, and I think a lot of the sort of hysteria we see in politics and stuff today. I think a lot of maybe personally, I wonder if a lot of that is actually partly because of detachment from nature, that we're sort of becoming hysterical about things that we shouldn't be hysterical about, or even like pop
yeah.
personalities as well. So how did the book come about exactly? What was the impetus behind writing it and researching for it? Because it's a pretty unusual subject, I think, although a relevant
Yeah,
one.
it actually began as an essay, and it was intended for, just to be published as a piece of sort of an anthology. Um, and the intended audience was generally going to be, heathen readership, and
Yeah.
that kind of fell through. And so, over the last few years, just I've added pieces to it here and there, and it started to grow a little bit more and a little bit more, and there it was. But I think initially, it began as a piece about the some of the folklore and the lore surrounding the oracular head, and really that kind of stemming back to Odin
Yeah.
and his use of an oracular head, and how that's all on some levels, represents the divinity of death, and even the idea of death being able to, and the dead being able to inform gods, that it was
Yeah. So
something even beyond them.
yeah, and so if I remember correctly, this is during Ragnarok and the final battle of the gods and the giants, and Odin goes to the severed head of Mimir to
Correct.
get the knowledge of the future, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's definitely interesting, right? Because also in the same mythology, you have the world tree, and one of the roots grows beneath the well of Mimir. I think I'm right in saying, and so it seems to be that there's a kind of more archaic knowledge than the gods, right? That he needs to get hold of in some way, which is kind of a curious thing to find in mythology.
Right. Right. And so, and I think it really goes to show, kind of exemplifies just that single um, that single piece of lore.
Yeah,
Really exemplifies the role of the dead. It kind of serves to illustrate how important they were, and that Odin himself, being the lord of the dead, um, spent a lot of time in those places, hanging around the gallows.
right. Yeah,
No
yeah,
pun. You spent a lot of time seeking the wisdom of the dead, and as a god of wisdom and of war and of death, among many other things, poetry. Uh, that a lot of his inspiration came from those realms that were essentially, inaccessible to a lot of people, and certainly to many of the other gods as well. And so that was sort of the impetus for the initial piece. And then and spreading out from there, there is a lot of lore surrounding that, and we see even in the Middle Age, into the late Middle Ages, and even into the present, maybe in the last the last century or so, preserved in a variety of ways and in a variety of places, from Iceland down into continental Europe, the British Isles, and even over into the Pennsylvania German communities here in North America. There are a lot of taboos and a lot of things that surround death, but there are also curative and apotropaic techniques that employ various bits and pieces of the dead, and certain times in in the German parts of Pennsylvania, the funeral homes would get a little bit crowded. They'd have to end up shooing people out of there, because they would be bringing their sick in and rubbing the hands of the dead at the funerals and things like this. And because of any variety of curative things that were attributed to the dead. So this is something that's still happening now, and these sorts of things, I think they never really waned or went away in other in traditional societies, and people in the West have a tendency to look at that as some sort of savage practices and things like that, but these are all very much a part of our history and culture in the West, and I think recognition of death and its power are important to really understand the sorcery of the forms of witchcraft, even some of the healing and cunning practices that we see today, still alive and doing well in different communities in the West. I think it's important to recognize that, to understand sort of the history behind that, and how revered the dead were, even when feared, always respected.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, if you do look at many ancient cultures, and some that are not even that ancient, the meditation on death does seem to be a big thing. I mean, everything from the samurai, who are supposed to, contemplate dying in horrible ways every day, to Freemasonry, which is a much later fraternity in the West, where one of the rituals, there's a very large focus on death, and the death of the first Grand Master, and in Britain and some European countries, there's a floor cloth with a coffin painted on it, and sometimes the body of the Hiram Abiff, the Grand Master, and a skull and crossbones and other symbols of death, and even so, there's still a few million men and some women in some jurisdictions who are going through that. But that seems to be a very archaic thing that's continued into the modern age. And of course, we know there's a Christianity. If you walk into a church, you see an image of Jesus on the cross, which is, I mean, one imagines they're supposed to remind you of your mortality, if nothing else. But
right.
And I think that the West has a kind of weird relationship to death, in that it's sort of taboo and you can't really talk about it. But if you turn on the TV in the evening, practically every drama has about 15 killings in it, and
Sure.
it's just entertainment. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I absolutely agree. I think it's really been, any sacrality has really been taken out of death. I think death is unfortunately really degenerated into an entertainment, like you mentioned, and it's really upsetting. I think removing that part of our lives, really, and having it transmuted into some sort of form of entertainment, and really to see people these days to pacifying themselves with these ideas. And you mentioned the samurai and the meditation on a gory and violent death, on a daily basis, things like that. there's a stark contrast in between between those two approaches to death, and how we how we see our own mortality,
Yeah.
and in the more archaic forms of Christianity too, with some the saints' relics and things of that nature. They were we see those older ideas, those older pagan ideas, really carry over into those practices, with the power being ascribed to death, and even to physical remains. The physical remains still carry that power with them.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Freemasonry and the death of Hiram Abiff, and that there's a sort of reenactment that occurs in the lodge, and as people come in and go through those sorts of things, I think it serves a really really important purpose as far as really humbling folks, and getting them to consider we don't have very much time here.
Yeah.
And it's important to make the best of what we do have with what we have when we are born.
And I should have maybe I should have mentioned as well that in some European lodges, there's a antechamber where before you're initiated into Freemasonry, there's a skull and crossbones, and you have to write out your will as if you're going to die. But that's a bit, and obviously there's a lot of tut-tutting about that from people who have never gone through it. But this is basically a practice that was in all cultures. You reflected on your death, and we're all terribly squeamish about it. But we are going to die, and we could die tomorrow, we could die today. So why should we live a sort of an illusion? Why shouldn't we live as if we're gonna die? And by that I don't mean go out and get crazy and get drunk, because that's not what we're going to be thinking about at the end of our lives, is it? When we're on our deathbed, we're not going to be thinking about the times we got drunk or picked up chicks or whatever. We're going to
certainly hope not. Yeah.
No, we're going to be thinking about the afterlife and deity, but also of course the few relationships that really mattered to us, and the few things that in our lives that mattered to us that we did or whatever. It's going to be much more serious, and I think unfortunately we maybe don't always have a very serious approach to life, because we try and block out these thoughts which are maybe a bit upsetting for some people. But
absolutely.
It's unfortunate, I think. And I don't want to get political or anything, but I mean, not just even human death do we take seriously, but also animals. When I walk through the supermarket, and all the meat is sort of packaged, beautifully to make it look more like fruit than actual meat. And we have almost no idea. We're in total denial about where it comes from. People see a picture of a sheep and think, "Oh, isn't it lovely?" And then they tuck into their sheep as if their lamb or whatever, as if it came from a tree or something. Well, it didn't, did it? And and obviously we've been eating meat, people around the world, for probably hundreds of thousands of years or more. But at the same time, from my understanding anyway, cultures that ate meat, say 1,000 or a few thousand years ago, they sort of revered the animal, and there were all kinds of special rites around, before killing it, and the animal was revered, and it was kind of a traumatic event, really. They didn't really like want to do it, I think, because they lived with them, and understood them. So
and I can, from exactly that, based on my personal experience, and with animal husbandry and raising animals that eventually, we end up consuming. It's certainly not a pleasant experience.
No.
Pleasant when they're alive, but it's also it's important to have food in the freezer, and having participated in that piece of the cycle myself, I will say that I feel like that's a really important piece of our relationship with nature that is missing today. It's certainly not pleasant.
No, obviously not. No, and I think a lot of people that do go to the supermarket to buy their meat that they want to eat, and I'm not condemning anyone for eating meat.
No.
People need to make up their own minds about what they want to do, and but people should do things with a proper understanding of what it is they're doing, and see if they really are okay with it. But I mean, I think a lot of people would completely condemn someone who killed an animal and ate it. But at the same time, if everybody who ate meat did that, there would be very few meat eaters.
Yeah, absolutely. There absolutely would, yeah.
Or there would be a lot less meat consumed. People would be like, okay, once a year maybe or whatever. But there we are.
Much more infrequently, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. But and actually, I was listening to a lecture by Hamza Yusuf, who's an American-born Muslim convert who's pretty popular, a very interesting guy. And I was surprised, actually, but he said that actually even, Muhammad said that you shouldn't eat meat 2 days in a row. And we tend to think of that of Islam as being quite a meat-eating culture. So I mean, and I only bring that up as an example because we do tend to think of that as a much more meat-based culture in terms of diet, whereas Buddhism we tend to think as totally vegetarian, or the Shaolin monks ate meat. But anyway, perhaps you could just tell us a little more about the sort of ancient attitude towards death, particularly in Indo-European culture. And again, the book tends to focus more beyond that, but I will say, as far as time, into the early and medieval era. But I would say that death was an integral part of the creation myths of the Indo-European peoples. And in particular, in looking at the Germanic creation myths and some of the things surrounding that, and if we look at the story of Odin and his sort of recreating a world that was in existence, the giant sprung up and the existed there in something of, at least by Odin's reckoning, some sort of a disgusting pulsating mass of ugliness, and so he with the assistance of his two brothers, they tore him apart and recreated this world that we know now, using the bones for mountains, and the blood became the sea, and so on, and sort of transmuted this static kind of cosmic state of maybe chaos, so maybe not so static, but taking this chaos and kind of refiguring it into a much more pleasant and productive and situation, something much more pleasing to him. So through the process of death, new life was reborn, and the multiverse, the tree, all these things kind of sprang out of this somewhat repulsive early situation that sprang out of Kanungagap, out of this void of darkness. And I think that pattern, having come from earlier Indo-European sort of myth, transformed, as it came along to the Germanic people and moved further west, and really, I think carries through in a lot of the varying forms of folk magic and folklore and healing practices that we see that have come down to us today, that are still around. Sympathetic magic and things like that deal very, very intimately with death. From, as I mentioned earlier, the hand of the corpse, removing sickness from the ill, or splinters taken from coffins, and the power that just abides in that. So all of these things that surrounding death, funerary implements, arm bones, any manner of thing, carrying that power of the dead with some ability to transmute tragedy and pain that we experience in our life into a better, something better. Taking auguries from entrails. I mean, it's just on and on there. Right.
Example after example.
Yeah. And some of these, at least, maybe not all, if not all of them, you can find in other cultures as well, obviously.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
and a lot of what you're saying reminds me of voodoo as well. So
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah, and in those, here in the Western United States, Santeria and
yeah,
Olomayombe are both very popular. We have
yeah.
large migrant populations, and that's very prevalent here, and that's caused some legal problems for some of those folks, unfortunately.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a gentleman here. He was a practitioner of Olomayombe, not far from where I live, and he'd had some trouble with the law for possessing, a human skull, and
Oh,
he was arrested, jailed,
wow.
and eventually charges were dismissed. But that again kind of shows really our detachment or even willingness, in the West to understand this relationship with death, to say even a beautiful relationship with death and the dead, with our ancestors.
Yeah.
It's just not. It hasn't carried over as well as it has in other traditional cultures. Which is really unfortunate.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Yeah, and just as a note in passing, obviously a lot of Westerners or Caucasians or white people, whatever you want to say, are becoming members of or joining Paolo Mayambe
Sure.
and Voodoo and Santeria and Hoodoo and so on. So yeah, but yes, it's
Quite
a
chic.
kind of, sorry.
Getting quite popular, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, it
And I
is.
think that speaks to a need in the West for that relationship with the ancestral cult and with death that is really missing.
Right.
The cult of Santa Muerte is also really grown popular out here too, and it's beautiful to see people really embracing the idea of death and trying to, forming a relationship with not only their own mortality, but also their ancestors, and really trying to honor their lineage, both their blood lineage and the lineage of their teachers, in whatever
Yeah.
whatever tradition they come from. But
Right.
these sorts of things really aren't as present. They're just not present for Western folks, at least not
Yeah.
not in a big way, not in a big way. A lot of those things have been stamped out into very intentionally, in the course of the last
Yeah.
1,000 years, demonized, vilified, pushed, marginalized. I mean, things like that would, 500 years ago would have been grounds, to have to for execution.
Yes. Yeah.
Easily.
So you're saying that Christianity had quite an effect on changing our sort of relationship towards death and our ancestors.
I think so. Yes. Definitely, it definitely did. But I would almost lean toward more of it being the church as an institution,
Right. Right.
as
Yeah.
more than more than the faith, and how the Christian faith kind of came into the Germanic realms, and slowly into on a popular kind of came into the among the popular peoples.
Yeah.
You're looking at rituals like the Eucharist and things like that. I mean,
Yeah.
there's certainly a lot of emphasis on death and dying, and a transmutation that occurs there.
Yeah. And actually, during the Black Death, there was actually a book sold about how to meditate on death in Christian Europe, actually. But I think maybe later on, the relationship changed. Maybe as Christianity became in a way more modern and more in a sense more secular. I'm not really sure. But yeah, that and actually I should mention this about. I don't know if you know, but during the 16th or 17th century, a lot of like Dutch paintings of portraits of wealthy patrons, they would paint a skull and crossbones on the back as a reminder of their death and this kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, certainly at some point it does seem to be that it sort of changed in Christianity. I'm not really sure why, but yeah, we sort of inherited some sort of attitude towards death that's maybe not entirely healthy.
Right. No, absolutely, and I think perhaps a part of that is because the church as an institution rather than a faith, but as an institution recognized how empowering that was for
Yeah.
people, who were actively participating in that relationship
Yeah.
with their ancestors and with the dead,
Right.
and in speaking to other practitioners from a variety of different traditions that work closely with the dead, there's something really beautiful happens for them, and
Yeah.
they and it's certainly empowering. And I think at various points in the history of the church, in its varied forms, it didn't really want to share a lot of that power and allow people to
Right.
to grow and kind of be in that. And so I think that maybe had I feel like that probably had something to do with it.
Yeah, right. So it's not so much the Christianity doesn't allow you to think about death. It doesn't want you to be in a relationship with your ancestors. That's the worrying part for Christianity. And then it's sort of interesting that today, there's such hostility, especially in the universities, towards the creators of culture of 100 or a couple of hundred years ago, if they're Western in many cases.
Yeah,
and it's sort of like an anti-ancestral cult in a way, which is pretty much the opposite of pretty much every culture and civilization that's ever existed, really. So,
yeah, I've seen a lot of the universities in Europe, Scandinavia, closing down their runic studies programs, and it's just really unfortunate. It seems to have really become a taboo place, and so there's really pretty acute identity crisis happening in the West right now, and
I think so,
and has been ongoing, for some time.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting, right? Because when you mentioned that, and you mentioned Odin going to the head of Mimir, and it's, which means the rememberer, and it does seem like the West is becoming a culture that's sort of anti-ancestral and anti-memory in a way. But I just mentioned that in passing. But I mean, and I don't want to get political, but with more and more immigration of people from traditional cultures, the only really sort of authentic way that you can relate to people with other cultures is in a way, I mean, either you have to adopt their culture or adopt something that's like it, or reach back into your own culture. And I think that a lot of the tension is that we expect to embrace, in a way, extremely conservative and traditional people with extremely religious views by going on about the most secular and modern ideas that you could imagine. I mean, there's nothing in common with. It's quite bizarre. But anyway, that's by the by. But
I totally agree. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. So we've looked a little bit at the history and mythology, but perhaps you could. Perhaps you could just say what might be your advice if for people today who are interested in spirituality and religion and this sort of thing, or just want to live a more authentic life. What would your advice be about approaching death and issues around that? Are there things that we might do, perhaps?
Well, that's a big area.
Yeah, I sprung that on you, I know.
Oh no, that's fine. And that was one of my hopes in getting this this book out and this material out there, really was that somehow it could maybe inform people's personal practice, or that somehow it may serve to inspire people to really look into that for themselves, to seek that relationship with their ancestors and with the dead, and with because it's unavoidable, and it's it's rooted in the daily language that we use, how we choose to view the world and how we interact with one another, this folklore and these mythical models that Western culture has sprung out of, and really still in some ways, at least at a foundational level, it's still based on that, and we look at there's definitely a hole in the oh, how to put it. There's definitely something missing. In the West, it seems people are just really dissatisfied. Maybe
Yeah.
there's an we're kind of a consumer culture and a throwaway culture. There's no value ascribed um, to the rootedness,
Yeah.
and to being in a state of really understanding the past, and how much it informs who we are now, and then in looking ahead, going into the future, and how we interact with one another, how we approach something as simple as, again, what we sit down to enjoy at the dinner table in the evening. I mean,
Yeah.
these things are all really foundationally rooted in, and the information's there. So I guess everybody's experience is going to be different. I don't know. For me, a lot of that grounding, really, and centering came from linguistic study. I started, of course, in high school, with pre-German and German, and it was really fascinating to me to see how the English, contemporary American English language correlates to ancient Germanic tongues, and beyond that, the relationship to Indo-European tongues, and then looking at and examining the language and the connections that are happening there, and it really allows us to have sort of eyes, through our ancestors, and how they interacted with the dead, for example, and how that was viewed, from a more traditional or archaic standpoint,
Yeah.
and how much that informs how we do things today too. Those things don't necessarily go away entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, there are these kind of ghosts of an archaic understanding of death, and still today, particularly in the contemporary West, at least in a lot of places, just the sight of a dead body, it really evokes a strong emotional response, and it should, but it's so uncommon for us today,
Yeah.
so, like, physically removed from the process of death and dying in many cases.
Oh, yeah, almost all cases, right? I mean,
Sure.
I would think that even probably 100 years ago, or a little bit more than that, in most European countries anyway, and probably in America as well, that when your grandparents died, they were probably in most cases dying at home, not in a
Sure.
hospital. So even the children were going to be exposed to that.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
we don't, generally speaking, have that these days.
No, not at all. No.
So when a person is researching folklore and maybe folk magic and things like this, and they run into some of these um, some of these different formulas, some of the Icelandic material is pretty it's pretty explicit, it's pretty graphic, and some of the
Yeah.
ideas, and I think a lot of folks would say, where on earth am I going to acquire a human femur bone? We have the internet, those sorts of things that
Oh, Bill.
can be acquired,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's just such a strange, almost, seemingly alien idea to even be in possession of such a thing, but
Yeah.
that wasn't always the case. There
No,
was.
no. And as you mentioned, it might be a little bit legally risky in some
Sure,
cases.
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
So,
absolutely. So,
yeah.
yeah, I think, I don't know. I feel like it was, at least for myself, it was really beneficial to to look at these things. And again, it's funny how personal research will take you one direction or another,
Yeah.
and it just kind of builds on itself. But and seeing some of the links between plant lore and the dead, and how those things correlated, things in the natural world, and our relationships with them, they've been stifled. We live in an entirely different world, and that's certainly understandable. But to be able to really tap into some of that, and try and understand that and personalize as much as we can, I think, really like for me, certainly informs the way that I conduct my daily life, and interact with my family, coworkers, and things
Yeah.
like, it's humbling, and it's beautiful.
Okay. Well, that might be a good place to wrap it up for now. But perhaps you could just let people know where they can find out more about you and where they can buy the book and anything else do you think might be relevant.
Sure. Yeah. No. Again, the book, The Language of the Corpse, is being released, slated for publication and in September of this year.
Yeah.
Three Press. It's the publisher, and they're a wonderful, wonderful imprint, and it's really an honor to be able to publish with them. I've, I've been a fan of everything that they've put out, so far. And yeah, you can visit. It's currently available for pre-order through the Three Hands Press website, and I hope that ultimately my hope is that some of the folks that come into this book might find something um, useful, inspiring, or
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for speaking with us. It's been awesome.
oh, thank you. I really appreciate your interest in this and your time.
Oh, no
Absolutely.
worries. Thanks very much.